The clock was moving toward midnight. Paris was glowing. The streets were alive with the sounds of a city that had no idea it was moments away from witnessing one of the most shocking tragedies of the modern age. Inside one of the most famous hotels in the world, Princess Diana was spending what would become the final hours of her life. She was only 36 years old, and from the outside everything looked different from the years of pain that had defined so much of her public story. She was no longer trapped inside a troubled royal marriage. She was no longer trying to survive the expectations of being the future queen. She was a divorced woman rebuilding her identity, a mother, a humanitarian, a global figure who seemed to be entering a new chapter. But before sunrise, everything would change. For years, people had imagined Diana's final night as a mystery, a night filled with unanswered questions, a night where ordinary decisions suddenly carried enormous consequences. Why did she leave the hotel when she did? Why was the journey changed? Why did the car take that route? Why did a night that appeared ordinary become the final chapter of one of the most famous lives in history? The answers would be investigated for years, but the emotional weight of that night has never disappeared, because behind every timeline, behind every investigation, behind every official statement, there was still one simple reality. A woman was leaving a hotel in Paris, and she would never return. August 30th, 1997, Diana arrived in Paris with Dodi Fade after spending time together during the summer. The relationship had attracted enormous media attention. Every photograph created headlines. Every public appearance became a global event. The world was fascinated by Diana's life after divorce. People wanted to know who she was becoming. Was she finally free? Was she beginning a new relationship? Was she building a future away from royal restrictions? But there was something else happening. Diana was also trying to find peace. The years before had been exhausting. The breakdown of her marriage to Charles had placed her under constant public attention. Her personal struggles had become international news. Her emotions had been analyzed by millions of strangers. Yet in the final months of her life, many people around her described a woman who seemed to be changing, more confident, more independent, more focused on her own choices. The summer of 1997 was not supposed to be the end. It was supposed to be a beginning. Diana had spent much of that year building a new public identity. She had traveled internationally. She had continued humanitarian work. She had become one of the strongest voices supporting the campaign against landmines. She was no longer simply known as a former princess. She was becoming known for the causes she believed in, and that makes her final hours even more difficult to understand, because history often remembers people through their final moments. But Diana's final moments came during a period when she appeared to be moving forward. At the Ritz, Paris, the atmosphere seemed calm. The hotel was familiar territory. Dodi Fade's father owned the Ritz, and Diana and Dodi spent time there before their planned journey. The couple had dinner at the hotel. Outside, however, photographers waited. The attention surrounding Diana had always followed her. But that night, the pressure was extreme. The paparazzi wanted images. The world wanted another glimpse of Diana, and the people around her knew that avoiding the cameras had become part of daily life. Shortly after midnight, the decision was made to leave, not from the main entrance, from a rear exit. The goal was simple: avoid the photographers waiting outside. A different vehicle had already been used as a distraction. The Mercedes carrying Diana and Dodi quietly departed. Inside the car were 4 people: Diana, Dodi Fade, driver Henri Paul, and bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones. None of them knew they were entering the final minutes of their lives. The journey should have been short, a few minutes through Paris, a normal drive, a simple trip, but somewhere between the hotel and their destination, everything changed. The car entered the Pont tunnel. Approximately 12:23 a.m., the Mercedes crashed into a concrete pillar. The impact was catastrophic. Dodi Fade and Henri Paul died at the scene. Trevor Rees-Jones survived but was seriously injured. Diana was critically wounded. What happened next became one of the most discussed emergency responses in modern history. Because Diana did not die instantly, she was alive. Emergency workers arrived. The damaged vehicle was surrounded. The world outside continued sleeping, while inside that tunnel, rescuers fought to save one of the most famous women on Earth. But the rescue itself became part of the questions people continued asking. Why did it take time to remove her from the wreck? Why was she transported to a hospital rather than another location? Why were there so many conflicting early reports? In the hours after the crash, information changed rapidly. The world was trying to understand something that seemed impossible. Princess Diana was gone. At Pont Hospital, doctors attempted to save her life. They worked for hours, but the injuries were too severe. Shortly before dawn, Diana was pronounced dead. The news spread around the world, and within hours, millions of people were grieving someone they had never personally met. But the story of Diana's final hours did not end when the doctors stopped working. In many ways, that was when another chapter began. Because whenever a historical figure dies suddenly, especially someone as famous as Diana, people search for meaning. They revisit every decision, every conversation, every photograph, every unexplained detail. They ask, was there something everyone missed? Was there a warning sign? Was there something hidden beneath the final public image? Over the years, multiple investigations examined the circumstances surrounding Diana's death. The French investigation and later British inquest examined the crash, the driver, the role of pursuing photographers, vehicle conditions, and other factors. The official conclusions found that the crash resulted from dangerous driving and other contributing factors, including the pursuit by paparazzi and the failure to wear seatbelts. But even after those findings, public fascination remained because Diana's life had always existed between two worlds, the official world and the emotional world. The official world wanted facts, the emotional world wanted understanding. And that is why Diana's final hours continue to capture attention, because people are not only asking what happened, they are also asking, who was Diana in those final moments? Was she happy? Was she hopeful? Was she afraid? Did she believe she was finally free? The tragedy is that nobody can fully answer those questions, but the final hours do reveal something important. Diana was not frozen in history as the unhappy princess from the early 1990s. She was a woman in transition, a woman trying to build a life after losing the one she thought she would have. A woman who had survived enormous pressure, a woman who appeared ready for a future nobody expected. And that is what makes the night so haunting. It was not the end of a story that was already finished. It was the sudden ending of a story that seemed to be beginning again. The most haunting part of Diana's final hours is that nothing about the beginning of the night appeared extraordinary. There was no obvious sign that history was about to change. No dramatic farewell, no final speech. No moment where anyone around her understood that they were witnessing the end. That is often what makes sudden tragedies so difficult to accept. Life continues normally until one moment divides everything into two parts, before and after. Before the crash, Diana was simply a woman leaving a hotel in Paris. After the crash, every detail of that journey became something the world wanted to understand. The questions began almost immediately. Why did Diana and Dodi leave the Ritz when they did? Why use a different exit? Why was there such intense media attention around them? Why was the car moving through Paris at that particular moment? These questions became part of the public conversation for years. But behind the headlines was a much simpler reality. Diana had lived under extraordinary attention for most of her adult life. Avoiding photographers had become a normal part of her existence. Every public appearance created a race between privacy and publicity. Every journey required planning. Every movement could become a worldwide story. The pressure surrounding Diana was unlike almost any other public figure. She was not just famous, she was royal. And even after leaving the royal family, the public's fascination never disappeared. In fact, in some ways it intensified. People wanted to know everything: where she traveled, who she met, what she wore, what she said, what she felt. The cameras followed her because the world continued to demand images of her. And on that final night in Paris, that same attention became part of the tragedy. When the Mercedes left the Ritz, several photographers followed. The pursuit became one of the central issues examined after the crash. The question was not only about the car itself, it was about the environment surrounding the journey. A famous woman, a powerful media industry. The driver was Henri Paul. At the time of the crash, he was the acting deputy head of security at the Ritz Paris. Later investigations focused heavily on his condition that night. Tests showed alcohol levels above the legal limit, and investigators concluded that his impaired driving was a major factor in the crash. But for many people, understanding the facts did not remove the emotional questions, because Diana's death did not happen in isolation. It happened at the intersection of several forces: fame, privacy, speed, media pressure, and human decisions made in seconds. The tunnel itself became one of the most famous locations in the world. The Pont de l'Alma tunnel had become an ordinary part of Paris, but after that night it became a place forever connected with Diana. People visited. Flowers appeared, messages were left. The location became a symbol of a moment when a modern fairy tale suddenly ended. But perhaps the most painful detail was that Diana was still alive after the crash. Emergency workers reached the scene. They found a devastating accident. The vehicle was severely damaged. The situation was critical. But there was still hope. Diana was not immediately gone. There was still a chance. The rescue operation became another major focus of public discussion. In emergencies, every minute matters. Every decision matters. And when the person involved is someone known by billions, every action becomes examined afterward. Why was she removed from the car at that time? Why was she taken to that hospital? Why did the journey take the amount of time it did? These questions were investigated by authorities. But because Diana was such a unique figure, ordinary questions became historical debates. The ambulance eventually transported Diana to Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital. The journey took longer than some members of the public expected, but French emergency medical procedures operate differently from some other systems. Doctors continued treating her during transport. The goal was not simply speed. Inside the hospital, doctors fought to save her. They performed emergency procedures. They worked through the night. But Diana had suffered catastrophic internal injuries. The damage was too severe. At 4:53 a.m. on August 31st, 1997, Princess Diana was pronounced dead. The announcement changed the world instantly. Television programs stopped. News channels interrupted broadcasts. People woke up to a reality they could not believe. The woman who had spent years surrounded by cameras had disappeared from the world those cameras were meant to capture. But even before official investigations began, another story was already forming. A story built around uncertainty, because Diana's life had always contained contradictions. She was one of the most photographed people on Earth, yet many people felt they never truly knew her. She lived inside a palace, yet often spoke about feeling isolated. She was surrounded by attention, yet searched for privacy. And her final hours reflected those same contradictions. The world wanted answers. But grief often creates questions that facts alone cannot satisfy. People wanted to know what Diana was thinking, what she was feeling, whether she had plans for the future, whether she understood how much the world cared about her. Earlier that summer, Diana had appeared happier and more confident than she had in years. She had stepped into a different role. She was becoming known for humanitarian work. She was supporting causes beyond the royal family. She was creating an identity that belonged only to her, people.com. And that makes the ending feel even more tragic, because she was not looking backward, she was looking forward. The final photographs of Diana show a woman who appears calm, a woman unaware that history is about to change. And perhaps that is the most painful image of all, not a princess surrounded by tragedy, but a person simply living the final moments of an ordinary evening. The official investigations would continue. The evidence would be examined, witnesses would speak, reports would be written, but public fascination would remain because Diana's death represented something larger. It represented the collision between private life and public obsession, between personal freedom and worldwide attention, between a woman trying to move forward and a world that refused to stop looking back. And hidden inside those final hours was one final question. Not only, how did Diana die? But, what was Diana becoming before she died? Because the woman who entered that Paris tunnel was not the same young girl who walked into St. Paul's Cathedral 16 years earlier. She had changed. She had survived. She had discovered her own voice. And that voice would continue long after her final journey ended. The morning after Diana's death, the world woke up to a question nobody wanted to believe. How could someone so alive, so visible, so loved, be gone? The shock was not only because a princess had died, it was because Diana had become something beyond royalty. She had become a symbol of compassion, vulnerability and change. Millions of people who had never met her felt as though they had lost someone they knew. And when a person carries that much meaning, their death becomes more than a moment in time. It becomes a search for answers, a search for understanding, a search for the truth behind the final hours. In the days following the crash, attention turned toward the circumstances surrounding what happened. Investigators examined every detail: the vehicle, the driver, the route, the photographers, the condition of the road, the timeline. Nothing was ignored. Because Diana's death was not treated as an ordinary accident, it was a tragedy involving one of the most recognizable people on Earth. The French investigation examined the immediate causes of the crash. Later, the British inquest, known as Operation Paget, also investigated numerous theories and questions surrounding the circumstances of Diana's death. After years of examination, the official conclusion was that Diana and Dodi Fade were unlawfully killed because of the grossly negligent driving of Henri Paul and the pursuing paparazzi vehicles. The investigations did not find evidence supporting claims that Diana's death was the result of a planned assassination. But official conclusions do not always end emotional questions, especially when the person involved is Princess Diana, because Diana's story had always existed between two realities: the reality recorded in documents, and the reality remembered by millions. The official record could explain what happened, but people still wanted to understand what it meant. For many, the biggest mystery was not only the crash, it was Diana herself during those final hours. Who was she at the end of her life? Was she finally happy? Was she hopeful about the future? Was she preparing for a new chapter? Those closest to Diana during the final period of her life described a woman who was changing. She was becoming more independent. She was focusing on humanitarian causes. She was building a life outside the restrictions of royal duty. Her divorce from Charles had ended a difficult chapter, and she appeared determined to define herself on her own terms. This is perhaps the most important part of understanding Diana's final hours. They were not the ending of a broken woman, they were the final moments of a woman rebuilding herself. A woman who had spent years being judged by others, and was finally learning to trust her own identity. The public often remembered Diana through the struggles, the difficult marriage, the royal conflicts, the emotional interviews, the media battles, but the final year of her life showed another side. She was not only reacting to events, she was creating something new. Her humanitarian work had become central to her identity. Her campaign against landmines gained worldwide attention. Her visits to hospitals and communities showed a style of public service that felt different from traditional royal appearances. She was not simply performing a role. She was trying to make an impact, and this is why her death felt like more than a personal tragedy. Many people felt that the world lost a voice, a person who had shown that power did not have to mean distance, that influence did not have to come from authority alone, that compassion could become a form of leadership. But the questions surrounding Diana's death also revealed something about fame itself. The same public attention that made Diana one of the most influential women in the world also created enormous pressure. The cameras that followed her success also followed her private moments. The fascination that made people admire her also made privacy almost impossible. Her final journey became a symbol of that contradiction. Diana wanted to live freely, but freedom was complicated when millions of people wanted access to her life. She wanted normal experiences. But normal life was almost impossible for someone whose every movement created headlines. The tragedy was not simply that Diana was famous. It was that fame changed the conditions around her. A simple drive through Paris became a global event. A private relationship became international news. A normal evening became a historical moment. And perhaps that is why Diana's final hours remain so powerful decades later, because people are still trying to understand the person behind the image. Not the princess, not the celebrity, the woman. A woman who was born into privilege but experienced deep personal struggles. A woman who entered a world built on tradition and slowly discovered her own voice. A woman who was photographed constantly but still searched for moments where she could simply exist. The final photographs of Diana are haunting because they capture something ordinary. There is no dramatic goodbye, no awareness of what is coming, just a woman leaving a building, walking toward a car, beginning a journey that should have ended like any other. But history remembers that journey differently. Because after that night, Diana's story changed forever. She was no longer only the princess who married the future king. She became a figure whose influence continued beyond her lifetime. Her sons carried parts of her legacy forward. The causes she supported continued. The conversations she started remained. And the way people viewed the monarchy itself changed. Years later, debates about Diana continue. Her life, her choices, her relationships, her struggles, her achievements. But beneath all those debates is something simple. People remember how she made them feel. That may be Diana's greatest legacy. Not the photographs, not the titles, not the royal ceremonies, but the connection. The feeling that someone born into extraordinary circumstances could still understand ordinary human pain. The mystery of Diana's final hours is often described as being about unanswered questions, but perhaps the deepest mystery is something else. How did one woman, who lived such a short life, leave behind such a lasting impact? How did someone who spent years feeling unheard become one of the most remembered voices of her generation? The answer may be found in the same place where her story began. Not inside a palace, not inside a royal ceremony, but with people, the people she met. The people she helped, the people who saw something genuine in her, because in the end, Diana's final hours were not only about how her life ended, they were about what remained after it ended, a legacy that continued, a memory that survived, a voice that could not be silenced, a quiet photograph of Diana, soft light, an empty room, no crowds, no cameras, no royal ceremony, just the image of a woman who changed history. And decades later, one truth remains. The world did not only mourn the princess it lost, it remembered the person she became.